All right, so we are going to move into a discussion on new minerals legislation. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got here, where we are, and where it might go. I recognize that most folks from industry really don't know a whole lot about what happened in the process and what's happening, and so that's really the goal here. There's been a lot of work, and it's happened primarily behind the scenes. So we hope to open up some of those things that I think are really important to share. So Nathan Miller is going to start us off.
Okay, hi everyone. So my name's Nathan Miller. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Sustainable Resources at Energy, Mines and Resources, and I've been involved in the process to develop new mining legislation since we began the process. So first of all, thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to everyone. And just, it's an important topic, and I know that there's perhaps not a lot of visibility, so we're hoping to shed some light on that for some of you today. And one of the questions that Brooke had asked me as we were coming up to speak was, can you talk about the disparate views that we've been dealing with, because it is indeed a topic where there are a lot of different views, and I think, one thing I'd say is if everyone agreed, this would be a really easy process, right? So I think that's part of the challenge that we've had, and I think I'll speak to some of the ways in which we have set up the process and been working through the process to be able to bring in those different views as we went along. And I also just want to recognize the importance of the legislation in creating the conditions for a viable, sustainable, and successful mineral industry. And just recognize that we need to be doing this work together with First Nations, with industry, and we need industry involvement when we're developing the regulations, legislation, and policy that governs the activities. Janet spoke a little bit. We are in caretaker mode, so I'm not going to talk a lot about Yukon government's views moving forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how we got to where we are today. And I do have a little bit of a couple of slides just to set some of the stage. And actually, I did want to start by talking about some of the work that has led up to where we are now in the process. And I started this timeline in 2003. I mean, we could have started this timeline in 1898 because there are some elements of the laws that date back to the Klondike era gold rush. But I started this in 2003, which was the date of devolution in Yukon, and also the Yukon Devolution Transfer Agreement effective date. So as part of that agreement between Canada and Yukon, there was also an agreement between Yukon and First Nation governments that the legislation, the natural resource legislation that we inherited from Canada in 2003, that we would work together collaboratively to develop new legislation. So that's for not only for mining, but for water, for forestry, and for land. And so you can see in this early part of the timeline, we have completed the work to develop new Forest Resources Act under the DTA commitment. And in about 5 years ago, we started the new process for public land, and 4 years ago for mining. So they are processes that have taken a long time, but I think that is because we need to get them right. We need to do them together, and that does take some time. The other sort of the blue bars are really more about more recent activities. A lot of them are mineral related. The last panel talked about some additional sort of contextual things that have changed over this period of time. Wetlands, regional land use planning, things like that are not even included in this, but that context continues to evolve. In particular, I would point out the mineral development strategy. We had a panel who worked for a couple of years engaging with the public and engaging with the sector, trying to understand what the issues and interests were for the mineral sector and development of the industry moving forward. And I think I'm sharing this with you because it's not like we were starting with a blank page when we started this process. There had been lots of engagements, lots of conversation around what were challenges, what were opportunities, and the work to develop the new mining legislation, I think, springboarded off a lot of that. So just wanted to make that point. So when we did start the work 4 years ago in the fall of 2021, this is a slide that kind of talks a little bit about the governance, so how we set up this, this process. And so we established a steering committee. The steering committee is a government-to-government body that was mandated with leading the process to develop the legislation. Participation had representatives of Yukon government, the Council of Yukon First Nations, and transboundary Indigenous groups. So there are actually 24, up to 24 parties to this steering committee. And we had very high levels of participation from these governments throughout the process. I'd say 15 to 17 of the 24 parties were represented, on an ongoing basis, right? So that gives you an idea of the level of interest and importance for these governments in developing this legislation. We also knew that we were going to need to have a mechanism to have industry involvement and have conversations with industry from the beginning throughout the process. So we made a very conscious effort to set up these other tables. You can see the industry table, and I see a number of folks who were on that table in the room today, but we had 4 organizations represented. And we also had an ENGO table with 2 organizations represented. And the purpose of these tables was to provide a mechanism for the steering committee to interact with the industry, to get comments, to ask questions, to have dialogue, and get feedback on its work as it went along. So I think that was another way that we were very conscious in knowing that there were going to be a lot of different views, different perspectives, and we needed a mechanism to be able to bring those together as we did this work. It's a large process, different than maybe some processes that other jurisdictions have done where they focused on one element of the legislation. BC did one recently, just focused on mineral tenure and disposition of mineral tenure. This is a much broader one. It's looking at the, all aspects of mining, from exploration to production to closure to remediation, securities, royalties, right? So there are a lot of topics at play throughout, which added to the complexity, and I think in part to the timeline and also to getting the outcomes right. So again, lots of material online if you want to dig into it, but just to give you an idea of the types of conversations that we were having. And then just this last slide here to talk about kind of what this last 4 years has been like. We started off with a process which was really probably the most intense process, part of it for the industry table, where we were taking each of these topics, finding out what was working well, what was not working well, what the interests were in terms of developing the new legislation, and developing not only a single option, but typically a number of proposed solutions for these problems. That was also a purposeful choice. We asked a lot of the industry table representatives during this time, and it was very busy. Many different working groups, lots of documentation that we were receiving from them at the time, lots of time at the table. So that was a very important step, and that was really exploring the ideas and then coming up with some proposed solutions. And then we were able to take that work and go and have a much broader public conversation. So over sort of spring, summer 2023, that's when there was a broad public engagement and First Nation consultation on some of these ideas. We again had tremendous amount of feedback and engagement from the sector. There was public surveys, there was targeted engagement. We held fora in Dawson and Haines Junction and Whitehorse, open houses and town halls, and got a lot of written feedback, as well as one that I remember that Brooke spearheaded, where it was one single document, but it had 300 signatures on it from the placer mining industry. So a ton of work went into these things, and I think they really set the stage for understanding the different views on some of these ideas that we were proposing. Which leads us to the sort of the last phase, and this phase has been going on for the last sort of year and a half until the writ dropped, which was really the discussions, mostly government to government, on the development of a framework for the legislation. So not the legislation itself, but this framework which would really set out how the legislation would work. There hasn't been a lot of sort of daylight into that. It's mostly been the government to government table until the last number of months, when there was some sharing of some elements of the framework with the industry table. So that's kind of where we left off. Janet spoke a little bit to the new incoming government, their commitment. There's also a commitment around the completion of the legislation in the platform, and I think on that I just say there's still a lot of work to do. It's really important work, and we need to do it together. We need to do it with industry and in partnership with First Nations. So probably took up a bit too much time there, but that's 4 years to capture in a few minutes. So with that, I'll hand it over to Heather.
Well, I actually have a question for you.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry. So when you say, lots of time engaging with industry, could you tell the folks in the room how much time are we talking about, Nathan? Because I don't think people know.
Yeah, well, and you asked me that before, and I didn't really do a tally, but certainly in that first year and a half, if you think about all the topics that we were dealing with, there was roughly a dozen, let's say. So for each one of those, there was a sort of a multi-stage thing where we're asking, okay, well, what are the issues with the current regime, right? In most cases, we got documents from each of the industry organizations. I'm sure that took them hours or days to prepare. Then it was, okay, what are the interests moving forward? What kind of changes should we be making? Again, hours or days to prepare each of those. In that case, we would often sit down and the steering committee actually struck technical working groups for most of these topics. So meeting with the technical working groups as they were then developing some of their ideas, proposed options or approaches. Again, going back and meeting with the sector and the tables. What do you think about those? Again, written submissions for the steering committee to contemplate. So I couldn't tally it up, but days, weeks of work on each of these topics. Again, a dozen topics, so significant amount of back and forth and dialogue. And if I may say, just I think that these folks did an amazing job at representing the sector in terms of providing input to the group, the clarity, the depth of understanding, and coming to the table really willing to work with governments in terms of finding solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot. It was great, though. Darren, would you mind introducing yourself? Sure. And you should have a mic.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. My name is Darren Lease. I'm a member of the Toronto-Quitchin in Dawson City. I've been practicing law for 30 years and represent a number of First Nations in organizations, including Council Yukon First Nations, on mining matters and devolution. So I just want to talk just really quickly about some of the key elements and some of the progress I think that's been made and some of the things that we need to continue to go forward with the new government. As Nathan pointed out, the key element for us, where this begins over the last 30 years, has been with the devolution transfer agreement from 2003. And I'm not sure if many people in the room were familiar with that process that took place in the late 90s and early 2000s that led to that agreement. But it wouldn't have happened. There wouldn't have, in my view, a transfer from Canada to the Yukon government for jurisdiction over waters, lands, mines and minerals, and forestry without the support of Council Yukon First Nations and the Yukon First Nations that signed on. It was a tripartite negotiation. It took place right in the middle of the land claim negotiations as they were being finalized. And a key component to that, why did First Nations support devolution? We hadn't before. In fact, we had opposed the oil and gas transfer agreement from 1993. And there was a real feeling of anxiety for the Yukon government to obtain more jurisdiction in the midst of these very complicated negotiation processes that were happening in communities. But First Nations also look forward to, okay, we're closing out most of the land claim agreements. We didn't obviously get them all, but we got 11 of the 14 First Nations, their agreements concluded and ratified. But there was a vision of partnership and collaboration that started with the Yukon Oil and Gas Act. That legislation was drafted, and then before it was enacted in the Legislative Assembly, there was a process where First Nations and Yukon government reworked provisions that dealing with consultation, dealing with the establishment benefit agreements, dealing with other aspects of the legislation, including the consent required for First Nations where there was not a land claim agreement in their place for the issuance of oil and gas authorizations. So based on that and seeing that First Nations and Yukon government could work to develop made in Yukon legislation, there was agreement reached for the devolution transfer agreement subject to certain terms and conditions. And one of those terms and conditions was the establishment of a successor resource legislative working groups to develop new legislation. So when devolution took place, mirror legislation was enacted by the Legislative Assembly here in the Yukon, which just mirrored the existing federal legislation, which we know is decades and decades old. It's out of date, and it requires an overhaul or repeal. So that commitment was made, and as Nathan pointed out, we worked on forestry legislation and got that completed 5 years after devolution. And then really no work on any other legislation took place until essentially 2021. And that created a lot of problems for us. There was a lot of mistrust about the commitment from government to work with First Nations, to really work with us in developing legislation with industry and others that made sense for the Yukon. Because of course it makes no sense for us to have mining in the Yukon under legislation that is 80 years out of date. The fees are still from the 1920s, and there really hasn't been any changes, as people know, to that legislation. There's been some regulations, some mining land use regulations enacted in the 1990s. There's been some amendments for consultation that was required by the Supreme Court as a result of the Ross River case. A lot of history there, a lot of mistrust, perhaps feelings that the public governments weren't committed to creating new legislation, and perhaps also a feeling that there's active resistance from not some, but not all, but perhaps some parts of industry to change. And also the overarching issue, of course, is the concern that First Nations have not benefited from mining in the Yukon. And if you go back and you read Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, the original document that was submitted to Prime Minister Trudeau and Indian Affairs Minister Chrétien in 1973, it speaks specifically about the marginalization socially and economically of Aboriginal people when roads were being built, mines were being developed in the late 60s up until the early 70s. And anger was in that document about how people felt they were being left out and not involved in the Yukon's economy. I'm glad to say that the work that we've done over the last 5 years, I think, has been very constructive. Despite all that history, I'm not saying everything's rosy, but there has been substantial commitments moving forward for people to start listening to each other, including First Nations listening to industry listening to us, and also with public government being actively involved and bringing forward different ideas, approaches, people trying to be creative. There's a lot of work to be outstanding, so I don't want to oversell this. There are some First Nations who've got serious issues with some of the matters that are currently on the table, so to speak, in a framework agreement. But the vast majority of the First Nations see that there's a good trail that we're on for developing something that's constructive, that's more balanced, that's modern, that's updated, that makes sense for the Yukon. But there are a couple takeaways, I think, that are really positive. The first is, of course, it's great to see mining and land legislation initiatives now being commenced pursuant to the devolution transfer agreement. That's really positive. That goes a long ways for developing a long-term relationship between First Nations and public government industry and others. We certainly need to be on the same page when it comes to mineral management, the requirement for long-term benefits for Yukoners from those developments. Specifically, I think there's been dramatically improved communication between certainly CYFN and the mining industry, mining organizations. In the 30 years that I've been doing this work, it's only been recently that there has been that engagement, and that I've been involved in impact benefit agreements on specific activities or projects in Mayo, in Kelowna, in Dawson, in Teslin. But the level of discussion that's in place now, I think, is promising. I know that there was some frustration when we were going through the last 5 years that Nathan set out. We were frustrated as well. There were some times when we weren't able to share anything with industry because we weren't making any headway with government. But I do say that when we did have proposals, and even when CYFN was developing proposals on things like disposition, we really appreciated the input that we got from industry. In some cases, we threw out ideas. They told us issues that we need to be aware of, whether it's like access for investment dollars for proponents to carry out their work, or whether it's the importance of the mining cycle and ensuring that disposition and licensing are sufficient to allow time for proponents to move their projects forwards within those mining cycles, make a lot of sense for us. And we were able to, I think, try to address those issues in a meaningful way. I appreciate the commitment from the industry groups not to breach confidentiality. When you're trying to develop a trusting relationship, when you have no relationship, that respect for us was very important. And I can say for the 5 years we worked with the mining groups, the industry groups, there was no concern at all around those issues. Of course, it got leaked out, but that wasn't a result of anything from the miners, and we appreciated that. I think that process of thawing relationships, perhaps, is very much in its infancy. However, it's very promising, and it does really emphasize the need for us to work together. Because if we don't, we're all going to fail. I'm going to talk later this afternoon on a different panel about why First Nations need a strong economy for mining. Why? Because you stay in our hotels, you fly in our planes, you use our goods and services, you shop at our stores, all those things. We're tied to the mining industry. And if we don't get it right through the new mineral legislation, it's going to hurt both of us. And that's a big problem. We don't want that. And I really want the takeaway today for people to understand that First Nations are really committed to finding solutions and having balanced legislation that makes sense for all Yukoners and all proponents. There was some good progress on some key issues. I'm not going to get into the details of them, but there is some of the key issues that are very contentious, very difficult, where I'm pleased to see that there was a good level of dialogue, a good discussion, and I think some good progress being made forward. For us, one of the big fundamental key issues that we need to restructure is the free entry system. And I know that makes people uncomfortable. I know it's going to look different, but it doesn't mean it's not going to work for people. And I did appreciate our discussions with industry as well as with government, as well as with the environmental groups, about looking alternatives, about ensuring that there is a process that makes sense. And I'm optimistic that when we pick up this work with the new government, hopefully we can continue on and reach some agreements. We also need to understand that First Nations, there's a perception out there under the land claim agreements that First Nations, their rights are limited to their plots of settlement land. We heard this in land use planning from previous governments where public government makes decisions on public lands and First Nations make decisions on settlement land. Well, it's not quite that simple. First Nations, under their land claim agreements, and more generally their Aboriginal rights, have those rights that extend throughout their territories, both on settlement and on non-settlement lands. What that means is that governments can no longer unilaterally just make decisions on public lands or public resources. There needs to be some level of collaboration. And we have talked a lot about that. We're not talking from CYFN's point of view. We're talking about a collaborative decision-making process, a commitment from government to work with First Nations in good faith to try to find common ground when we're talking about issuing licenses, permits, or authorization, granting mineral rights, dealing with reclamation, dealing with security. We're not taking in any way fettering government's authority to make those decisions, but we need to have something more than consultation, which is, okay, what do you think? Okay, I'll give consideration to it. Here's my decision. It can't be structured like that. It needs to be a true commitment to trying to find solutions and working with First Nations. Believe it or not, if this is so obvious, but the earlier First Nations are involved in these type of decisions, the more certainty it's going to give proponents in industry about their projects and activities. Hopefully we can avoid the situation where industry is undertaking activities for 3 or 4 years, spending significant money, getting investors' money, and then run into a concern raised by First Nations at some decision point down the road, and that doesn't benefit anybody. And so, that's what we're trying to look. have the collaboration decision-making up front, ensuring that we're all on the same page. I think also one of the key issues for Yukon First Nations, particularly those who are self-governing, is the new mineral legislation represents an opportunity for us to deal with a really contentious issue that was set out as a compromise in our land claim agreements, and that deals with subsurface lands and surface lands. And that's just set up in a way where on Category B lands, where the First Nation owns owns the surface, and the subsurface continues to be managed by the laws of general application, the Territorial Placer and Quartz Acts, really sets up First Nations and industry for conflict. And we need to deal with that in a way that allows those resources to be utilized, but ensure that we're avoiding the confrontation that currently takes place. And I don't have to tell people in the room, I know there's a lot of people in the room who are involved in staking, who are involved in projects in Category B. I know a lot of the proponents that have adopted progressive approaches where they enter into agreements with respect to activities if they're going to stake on Category B. I think the new mineral legislation needs to deal squarely with that, because that does create friction and confrontation in many, many circumstances. And I'd like to say, you know, those are sort of the large issues in my mind where there's a lot more work that's required, and a lot more work with industry, because we need to ensure that it works for industry, but also ensuring that we're involving other Yukoners as well to get their points of view. On other issues like reclamation, on abandoned sites, emergencies, financial security, compliance, monitoring, enforcement, I think there's general agreement. And what it is just updating and modernizing the legislation, seeing what works in similar jurisdictions, what the best practices are, and ensuring that the legislation is effective to protect the interests of Yukoners. Other matters like royalties, you know, we haven't really turned our mind to it, because I think there's a lot of discussion that's required before we even consider what the appropriate royalties are. Aside from there is a need for some form of placer royalty of some sort. I think everybody's agreeable to that, but I think to date we haven't had any discussions. So I don't want people to feel that there are decisions or people are so far down the road with respect to all these issues that you feel that your input has been excluded or marginalized. Because as I've mentioned before, if all the groups that know how that feels like and being excluded for something, your livelihood, your investment, the future of your children, we don't want that. That's what we've been facing and dealing with for decades. Where do I see for next steps on this? We need to reconvene this work. Pleased to hear the comments from the Premier Designate and others. I think that those are positive. I think there is a need for us to pick up these discussions, revive the momentum that we had. I think we need to confirm what that process looks like, what the government-to-government process looks like. I think we owe it to industry and other Yukoners as to how we're going to engage with them and when and what that's going to look like. I don't think there's any need for us to finalize this framework. I think we need to continue getting back to what the legislation is going to look like and what the drafting instructions will look like. So those are my thoughts. I don't want to oversell this, but I do see it as a significant step forward. There's a lot of opportunity. It has a lot of promise. And it's really up to us, the people in this room who are attending this conference, to build something better, because it's really to the benefit of all of us. So those are my comments, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. That was very comprehensive. Would you mind speaking just briefly about your actual role in the process? Yeah, CYFN, but also you were at all those meetings, and I think it's important for industry to hear that the things that you're talking about, you have a great deal of experience speaking to it.
Sure, it's a leap forward for First Nations. A lot of people are reluctant or unsure about being involved. CYFN has been facilitating the First Nation caucus. As you know, CYFN is not a party to the treaties. We're not a rights holder, so to speak. We represent not all the First Nations here in the Yukon, but our caucus that was involved in the mineral discussions had more than 20 First Nations. So we had pretty much all the 14 First Nations from the Yukon. Some were heavily involved, some weren't, because quite frankly, there's not a lot of mining in some territories. We had some transboundary groups. Those are Aboriginal groups who are not based in the Yukon, but their traditional territory extends into the Yukon. They have Aboriginal rights, or in some cases like treaty rights, like the Inuvialuit or the Gwich'in Tribal Council. There's other groups like the Taka River Tlinkits, Ake-Denicho, some of the Tahltan groups, the Kaska from North BC were involved. It was a complex, and with all the different circumstances, self-governing, non-self-governing, Yukon First Nation, transboundary groups, there's a whole different range of different approaches. And our job at CYFN, and two of my colleagues are here, Jewel and Avon, and I think Morgan's here, and she was also part of our group. She now works at the YG. Our responsibility was really trying to find some common ground as where we want to go. And I don't know, I was kind of like the facilitator, working with various lawyers from individual parties. It's complex and it's difficult to address all the issues that First Nations have. Some have got extensive history with mining, others don't. Some have good experiences, others don't, and some have a little of both. And a lot of First Nations feel absolutely overwhelmed with the amount of activity that's undertaken or proposed to be undertaken in the area. It's interesting to hear. I wasn't here for some of the guest speakers, but one of the speakers somebody mentioned was saying the window's open. You got to go do it now. You got to get out there and get busy. And that's kind of like the First Nation, like, whoa, we're overwhelmed as it is. We don't have enough capacity. Yessa is like, backed up. The water board's a mess. We don't have a capacity to even look at those applications. So, some of the things that we need to talk about is like, how do we create or move away from boom bust, right? How do we create a sustainable industry that really does benefit or create benefits for Yukon workers, for long-term benefits for the Yukon in a way that is manageable, because right now it's not. And what I keep telling people, including people in our caucus, is a solution to those answers is progressive new mineral legislation. And I think that's what CYFN has been trying to advance. And I think we've been lucky to have great input from First Nations who have a lot of experience, like my own First Nation, the Trondikwachian, or Notchinekdun, or Selkirk, or Little Samukarmaks, or Klawani, sort of in the central Yukon. But also recognizing that we are setting a bit of a precedent for decision-making, the role of First Nations when it comes to these other resources that we have to develop legislation for, particularly for lands and ultimately for waters as well. So it's complex. There's a lot of different interests there, a lot of different perspectives and views, and that's why it's taken a lot longer than I expected. I've been involved in a lot of negotiation processes over the years, and I don't think anything has been as complicated as this. On the other hand, what a privilege it's been to have some input into something that's going to shape the Yukon for the next 100 years. Because either we get it right and we all do really well for the next 100 years, or we're going to continue to just butt heads, and it's going to lead to more court challenges, it's going to lead to more community opposition, it's going to lead to proliferation or requests for more lands withdrawn. It's not good. We need to learn from where we've been over the last 35 years and establish a new path forward for the new legislation. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that was excellent context. Thank you. Heather, would you please introduce yourself?
I know you're all dying to know these chairs are way more comfortable than those chairs. Hands down. You're also probably wondering what I'm doing up here with these guys who came equipped with paper, I will point out. So I have no paper. I'm just going on process. So my name is Heather Burrell. I'm a geologist. I'm a Yukoner. My role in the new minerals legislation process was as the former chair of the Yukon Minerals Advisory Board. For people who don't know what the Yukon Mineral Advisory Board is, it's a ministerial advisory board that was formed in the late 90s under an NDP government. They are ministerial appointments. The board itself has a really wonderful, there can be up to 12 members. It's a really nice cross-section of our industry. So early stage exploration and prospecting, which is more of my lived experience, into mining, reclamation, civil contracting, and then placer mining. So it was created to give the government a sounding board for things, for the people that are actually out there doing the work. And so what does that look like for us? And so somewhere around 2021, I was chair of YMAB, and I got a letter from Minister Stryker that said, would you sit on this core steering committee with the Klondike Placer Miners Association, the Yukon Prospectors Association, and the Chamber of Mines,
Industry table.
which is the industry table. Initially, there was an industry table and an ENGO table, which had the Conservation Society and CPAWS. And then Stryker said, no, 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 you guys all have to meet at the same time. And we were like, oh, okay. But I think what we learned in that process, when we all sat at that core steering committee table, was that all of the groups around the table were aligned in that we want responsible mineral exploration done in the territory. We were also, every single meeting started with, this is confidential, which all of us on the industry side took really, really seriously. Obviously, I only speak or have experience in early stage exploration work. And so my counterpart from YMAB, Brad Thrall, who formerly with Alexco, and before that Brewery Creek, you know, he's found mines, started mines, closed mines, reclaimed mines. So his work experience obviously is a lot broader than mine. So Brad and I tag teamed the items that came forward through the new mineral legislation. Nathan thinks it's 12. I think there were like 15 things we were working on. There were a lot. And we would meet, we would have 3-hour meetings once a month, and that went on forever. And then on top of that, every single one of those 15 things had its own technical working group. So we would meet to talk about royalties. And then we would go away and we would put together tons of feedback. CPAWS and Conservation Society did too. And then we fed that into the core steering committee, whose then job it was to feed it up to the entire steering committee. I don't know how that looks, but that's how I picture it. And then we would have in-person technical working group meetings. So then those are additional 3-hour meetings to go through kind of the minutia and like, what does this look like? And what does that look like? And what do you mean you can't do that? And like, what do you mean this won't work when you actually get out on the land to do it? And so industry, I would say, because we have 7 minutes left, industry consistently showed up. The same 9 or 10 of us were there all the time because it's so important. This legislation is so important to us. The placer miners, every single time they had a chance, they said you should separate quartz and placer in the legislation, right? YMAB, we just harp on the fact that the legislation needs to be outcomes-based, right? Don't be prescriptive. Don't tell us how to get there. Tell us what we need to have as this product, right? Because technology changes, all of these things change, and so if you write legislation that is too prescriptive, we're going to be having the same conversation again in the future. Those are the big ones. And then we went into like this information vacuum, and then I just kept working on my regular work, so yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for all your hard work, Heather. I have a question for everyone. Based on how the discussions have gone in the last 3 days at the Geoscience Forum, do you see any obvious best case scenario wins that might be possible as new mining legislation progresses? And I think this is an easy one, but what are some easy wins? And Nathan, you might not be able to answer. So Heather and Darren.
Well, I think the first easy win is just reconvening the process and continuing the work that people have had input in. I think that's important for us, and that would be, I guess, a big win for sure. I think committing to a process that is perhaps more engaged with industry and others, I think, other Yukoners, I think is important going forward. I think that's important for us. I think we're at that stage now where we have a good idea of what we're bouncing back and forth on the issues, and I outlined some of those. I think those would be what I would see as immediate big wins in my view.
Thank you.
My thing would be industry loves certainty, and new mineral legislation is an elephant piece of legislation. And if there was some way for the new government to take all of the information and feedback that has been contributed to the process in the last 5 years and to focus on on priority pieces of it where changes can be made now, right? And just start with eating the elephant one bite at a time, right? Because the last thing industry needs is uncertainty in what we're trying to do with work. So,
Thank you. We have a couple minutes for questions from the floor, if there are any.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, how does the town, like, represent CFYN, but the CFYN takes their instructions from the individual bands, so I'm not, must be a bit of a balancing act.
Nope, not at all. Just kidding. There's a tension there for sure. And there's a tension when you're getting different views from different First Nations based on their own experiences, right? And it's a challenge. So it's our learning experience. We need to have open discussions. I think that the work that prospectors and other proponents do in the communities and developing those relationships goes a long ways. Also, government has a big responsibility to ensure they're transparent. Some of the things that happened at midsummer, dealing with the regulatory amendments, the release of the framework agreement, quite frankly, that really hampered our efforts to try to move things forward on the First Nation side when there is trust there, but it's developing. It's the ice is still pretty thin on that for some groups, and they go, oh well, there you go, look, they're not prepared to work with us, they're doing this and doing that, and you're like, well, somebody made a mistake and did this and released that document. But it is a challenge, and it's not easy. It's probably the same within your own industry organizations. You've got proponents with different points of view and different experiences. What we're trying to do is convince people that this is the way forward. This is worth the investment of time and effort in developing this legislation because it's so time-consuming and protracted. But the consistency, as Heather pointed out on our side, is really important. We were really fortunate. We more or less had the same caucus members for the entire period of 4 years. And I think that's one of the things that really helped us move this forward with government. Government, on the other hand, there has been changes there. And those changes, in some cases, it was helpful. In other cases, people move on to other jobs, other positions, and it does slow us down a little bit. But having strong political will from public governments and from First Nations, putting pressure on technicians to reach agreement is how we're going to get this done. There needs to be some guidance from that level around process and around timelines.
Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, the recommendations, has the government signed off on your recommendations, or are you still open for changes where you consult with us, the public? What's the situation there?
So from my understanding, there's been nothing signed off. It's just a bunch of work that's happened to date.
Further consultation with the public can change things,
yeah,
have an influence?
I'll take this one.
Thanks.
Okay, so what happened, which I learned from CBC, thank you CBC, is there was an ATIP request that was put into the government, and maybe the second CBC article that came out, it kind of highlighted how siloed the government is, right? And so Energy, Mines and Resources was the primary department that was working on this file under Nathan. The framework document went to Executive Council Office and Cabinet, right? Totally different. 1, 2, not touching. Apparently not talking either, which is a totally other thing, but not that surprising for those of us in industry. And so when the ATIP came in, nobody in Executive Council Office rang up Nathan and said, hey, we're being pushed for this. What do you guys think? Should we be doing this? How much of it should be redacted? This obviously is really sensitive. It's also a very big thing. It's very political, or leading into the election. I mean, if anyone had the radio on, every second question was about mining and what does that look like and what are your stands and how does this feel and what does that do? And so the document that you saw, Gary, was not meant for public eyes. It didn't have consensus at any level, but it was sort of a good example of you have to start somewhere. And it's always easier to edit than it is to write. And I know that because I edit a lot of stuff, but I don't write a lot of stuff. And so, yeah.
Yeah, just to confirm, the framework agreement itself was a snapshot of where we were. We were in the midst of substantive negotiations and recognizing an election call was going to happen. So we stopped work, tried to capture where we were at that time. There's still a lot of outstanding issues. None of the First Nations, nobody has signed it off, nobody has endorsed it, nobody has approved it. But for us, it's good in a sense of identifying where we are and where the issues currently stand. And there's a whole bunch of issues that require further discussion and in some case revisiting. And that's just from us. On some of the things like disposition, we've had some initial discussions with the industry, but there's going to have to be a lot more discussion. So I don't want people to think that it somehow is done and you're seeing or you're being asked for input for a document that's complete, because that's not the case. Certainly not from our point of view.
Yeah,
Gary, I'm going to have to stop you there. Sorry, we are out of time, and I've got.
specifically on my question there is, for example, on the free entry system, it's not locked in. It's still available for change for public consultation, is that correct?
Yeah, certainly from CYFN's point of view, that everything on the table is for further discussion. What you currently will see in a framework is what our thinking is of where that should lead to, but it's still very preliminary. And in all fairness, as I said earlier, industry hasn't had an opportunity to really digest it and get comments back to us. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to these panelists for making time to be here today.